I will be using Kieranite for this build because I have some pieces lying around my shop, but I don't necessarily recommend this material for your first knife, or actually in reality any knife that you plan on ever dropping, since this material can be a little bit brittle, but it does polish up nice and shiny, which is why we're going to use it in this build. So with that, let's get started on the handle. Now it's time to start working on the handle. I'd like to add a caveat here and mention that there are multiple ways to handle a knife, and this is just one of those methods. I have a handful of video tutorials that I'll put in the cards on how to make your first knife, and they actually use slightly different handle attaching methodologies if you're looking for some other techniques. While this method worked out just fine, I think I like the stacked scale technique a little better, even if you're using a hand drill. With all that being said, the basics here are to get the holes drilled in your handle scales using your knife blank as a drill guide. Once you have a hole drilled, make sure to put a pin in it so that your scale doesn't move around and become misaligned while drilling the other hole. For this project, we're going to be using some cheap 3/16 of an inch brass that I found on Amazon. The pin's OD was slightly larger than the holes I drilled, so I used a hand drill like a lathe and took down the diameter slightly. You can see here that I'm using 1-inch and 2-inch cant twist clamps to hold the pieces down and together, but this task could be completed with a normal C-clamp. I've also seen some other makers use small dabs of super glue to achieve this hold, but just make sure you don't use too much and that you can get the scales back off the knife after drilling. Once I have one side drilled, I label it so as not to get mixed up, and then drill the other side. At this point, you're going to need to clean up and finish the front section of your handle scales. Once the scales are epoxied onto your knife, this section would be extremely difficult to shape without scratching the blade. I started off by cutting away the bulk of the material from one scale and then filed the front of it to match my desired arc. I then used the first scale as a reference and drew a guideline on the second scale to repeat the process. Now that both scales were roughed in, I can pin them together and use a hand file to bring them flush with each other. After getting both scales flush with each other, I used a pencil resting on the blade blank to mark out a rough target line on the front of the scales to file in a chamfer. While this isn't necessary, it really helps to have a reference. I'm using a mildly aggressive half-round file here to bring the chamfers to around a 45-degree angle. These Nicholson files were part of a kit I bought back in 2018 and have been performing fairly well. Once the filing is done, I use some sandpaper to bring the front of the scales up to a 1000 grit finish. This step isn't strictly necessary, but I like to rough up the tang a little bit before epoxying on the scales to aid in adhesion. This can be done with any low grit paper. The first step to any glue up is to make sure all your pieces are nice and clean. To do this, use some alcohol or acetone. My favorite epoxy is G-Flex from West Systems. However, in this build, I'll be using some Rogue epoxy from Combat Abrasives, which is also a good choice. If this is your first knife, you can really use any 2-part epoxy that you have lying around. The rest of the process is pretty straightforward. Put a coat of epoxy on each of the handle scales, the pins, and the tang of the knife. Once I got everything put together, I lightly tapped in the pins, but note you should not have to use excess force here, and a pre-glue fit test is good practice. Once everything is together, use some spring clamps to apply light pressure while the epoxy cures. I'd caution against using C-clamps here, since too much clamping pressure can force the epoxy out of the joint. Also, this is the best time to use a Q-tip to clean up the squeeze-out epoxy on the front of the handle scales. After you've given your epoxy enough time to cure, you can move on to shaping the handle. Step 1 is to protect your blade by wrapping it with a paper towel. Next, you use a hacksaw to cut off the excess of the pins. With the bulk of the material cut off, you can use hand files to bring the pins down flush with the sides of the handle. During this project, I was looking at how much material I had to file off this handle and decided it was time for me to pull the trigger on a cabinet maker's rasp. I've had this in my cart for months based on watching some old videos from journeyman smith Carl Anderson. I'm happy I did because these are really a pleasure to use and they allow you to move a large amount of material quickly. If y'all are getting something out of this tutorial and maybe want to help out the channel, I'll be putting affiliate links to the tools and materials for this build in the video's description below, and I'll also have a link to my Patreon. Step 1 with the rasp is to get the bulk of the material removed down to the metal tang. I used the rasp to get close and then finish the last 30 seconds of an inch or so with my Nicholson files. Then I'll use some 120 grit sandpaper wrapped around the sanding bar to get out all of the large scratches. To get into the finger choil area, I used a piece of sandpaper wrapped around a metal dowel which I chucked up in my hand drill. This method works really well at getting everything square and speeding up the process. I find myself using this technique, which many may consider a beginner's hack, even on more technically difficult knife builds. Everything we've done to this point on the post-epoxy handle shaping has been to get the handle scales flush with the tang. Once they're nice and flush, we can knock off the corners so the handle feels a little better in the hand. I started off by filing in a 45-degree chamfer around the profile of the scales with my rasp. While this isn't rocket science, I'd advise taking some deep breaths and slowing down during this part of the project so that you can focus on getting both sides even and symmetrical. After I get them roughed in with the rasp, I move on to my files to dial it in and then round over to corners. To get the finger choil area, you're going to need a half round file, and like I just mentioned, some patience. The knife you turn out at the end of this process is really a reflection of the amount of patience you have to get everything clean and symmetrical with the files. After we have the filing done, I moved on to the sandpaper to bring the handle up to a 1000 grit finish, starting at a 320 grit paper, then stepping up to 600 before finally landing at 1000. The world is your oyster here, and if you want, you can continue to a higher grit and even buff the handle for a shine. Lastly, we're going to be sharpening the knife using a diamond stone. Alrighty, so we have finished up with our kit knife. It is sharp, the handle scales have been finished and attached, and we are finished up. The knife's good. You can use this for everyday carry type task easily. I could see this being used as a skinning knife as well. It fits nice in the hand. The heat treat is probably spot on from Jantz. As far as the fit and finish goes, obviously it's not going to be the level of a handmade custom knife, just because I used a hand drill on the pins and things like that. I didn't grind in these plunge lines myself, so you can see the cuts are a little off. They're a little not symmetrical. Things like that are what you're going to achieve when you start making your own handmade custom knives. But this is more than usable, and it's definitely a good way to get your feet wet and get in the game of knife making without having to go through the whole process. And actually, if I was going to start making knives, this is where I'd want to start. If I had to look back and say, hey, what should your first knife making project be? This is probably it, just because it doesn't take much to do, and you can get the feel for fit and finish and making handles and things of that nature, which is really a large portion of the task. And it'd be nice to section off what you have to learn. Just start off learning how to put a handle on a knife, and then you can get into making a knife itself. I hope you guys really liked this video. If you did, hit that like button down below. Consider subscribing to the channel.